Cy Young threw 749 complete games in his career. In 2024, there were only 19 total complete games across the entire league. Obviously, starting pitching has changed a lot since Cy Young took the mound in the 19th century. This difference causes a lot of problems when trying to compare players across different eras. These problems are seen the most when talking about Hall of Fame voting. Oftentimes, players on the ballot will be compared to players that are already in the Hall to see if they're truly worthy of induction. This comparison can be a little unfair, especially to the pitchers that are not obvious inductees like Clayton Kershaw, Justin Verlander, and Max Scherzer. There are several pitchers that are in the league now or already on the ballot whose numbers won't stand up to those of past eras. One of the most interesting cases is the career of Felix Hernandez, otherwise known as King Felix. His overall numbers don't quite match some of the legends already in the Hall, but the starting pitching position has changed a lot, and therefore how we analyze it should change a lot as well. Also, if you enjoy the video, make sure you're subscribed. It's completely free, and you can always unsubscribe at any time. First off, starting pitchers just don't pitch nearly as much anymore. If you look at the average length of a start for every year, it's gone down drastically since 1980. In 1980, the average start was around 6 1/3 innings. That would slowly decline through the turn of the century before absolutely falling off a cliff starting in 2014. If we look at the years that Hernandez pitched, he plays right up to and through that big fall off. This drop in starting pitcher usage can be attributed to many different reasons, but there are two main ones. First off is the health of starting pitchers. As these starters continue to push the limits of the human body trying to maximize velocity and spin rate, organizations don't want these guys to be throwing 120 pitches in a game. I think we all know the injury epidemic that's going on at the pitcher position, and in general, the less pitches a pitcher throws, the less likely an injury is. Also, injuries themselves cause starters to miss time and therefore throw less innings. That doesn't necessarily pertain to this graph, but it does affect the modern starter's usage quite a bit. The second reason is that it doesn't make much statistical sense to be pushing the starters to the limit. I've gone through this plenty of times on this channel, but the longer a starter stays in, statistically, the worse he performs. Bullpen arms are as talented as they've ever been today, so most of the time a team is better off using the bullpen rather than trying to stretch their starter out into the later innings. As a starter faces the same hitters over and over again, those hitters can adjust, and statistically, they're better the more times they see the same pitcher. So it doesn't make physical sense to have a starter pitch a lot of innings anymore, and it also doesn't make statistical sense. They're also getting injured at a higher rate than ever, so that doesn't help their usage either. But what does this lack of usage really mean for the modern day starter? Less usage means less value. If we look at the graph of the total WAR that starters were worth every year since the latest expansion, it follows a similar pattern as the last. In 1998, starters were worth 360 WAR over the course of the season, but in 2023, that number dipped to an all-time low of around 312. Not only that, but the total number of starters used in a year has significantly increased since 1998. Back then, there were only 282 different pitchers that started a game throughout the season. In 2024, there were 366. So, not only do starting pitchers have less WAR total, that WAR is being shared amongst more pitchers, giving less WAR to a starter on average. When evaluating careers, WAR is one of the first stats that anyone looks at. Starting pitchers in general have the least value that they've ever had. Gone are the days of guys going out and throwing complete game shutouts multiple times in a season. Now, most of them are asked to go out and just get through the opposing batting order twice before turning it over to the bullpen. Since WAR is a key stat in the Hall of Fame voting, this is going to give modern day pitchers a pretty severe disadvantage when being compared to the pitchers of yesteryear. But there have been some stats that aim to control for these kinds of things. One of these stats is era-adjusted WAR, developed recently by Daniel Ek and X Sports Lab. This model computes era-adjusted statistics through a principled balancing of how well a player performed versus their peers and the size of the MLB talent pool. Under this model, great all-time statistics require that an MLB player is both better than their peers and played during a time in which the talent pool is large. In this way, the model constructs an even playing field that extends across eras. Looking at the WAR for a modern pitcher like Felix Hernandez, it's pretty low for a Hall of Famer at 49.7 BWAR, which we'll get into that more later. But when you look at his era-adjusted BWAR, it makes him look a lot more valuable at 63.1. This is one of the biggest reasons why I think that he very well has a case for the Hall of Fame. If you adjust for the era that he played in, he becomes a lot closer to the value of some pitchers that are already in the Hall. On the other end of the spectrum, Cy Young's career 163.6 BWAR drops down to 59.2 when you account for the era that he played in. This is because it was a lot easier to accrue WAR in Cy Young's era, the late 19th century, than in the past 10 to 15 years. This isn't saying that Cy Young was bad and if he played today he would be awful, although that is true, that's not what this stat's saying. This is purely adjusting for the fact that a stat like WAR was easier to get in 1898. This kind of analysis I find very interesting and very useful. I, however, do not vote on the Hall of Fame. The writers do, and some of the writers are skeptical of even regular WAR, so I highly doubt that these kinds of numbers are going to influence something like Hall of Fame voting. But nonetheless, this stat serves as my proof of concept that King Felix has a shot at the Hall of Fame. But now we need to answer the question, just how good was Felix Hernandez? The first thing that we have to talk about when talking about Hernandez is his peak. From 2008 to 2014, there was arguably no pitcher that was better than him. In that time span, he led all pitchers with 40.7 FWAR, above guys like Justin Verlander, Clayton Kershaw, Zach Greinke. He was third among starters with a 2.82 ERA, only behind two obvious Hall of Famers in Clayton Kershaw and Chris Sale. When you look at ERA+, he was once again third, only behind the same two names. According to BWAR, he was tied for second with Cliff Lee, and Kershaw holds the top spot in this category. To be up here with some names like this in some of the most important statistical categories clearly shows that he was on the right track to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, no question. But why are we questioning it? Well, if you compare his numbers from before he turned 30 and after he turned 30, you'll find the answer. He debuted at age 19, and in those 11 seasons before he turned 30, he put up an ERA of 3.11, an ERA plus of 128, over 2,200 innings, and a BWAR of near 50. Not to mention, he also became one of the 24 pitchers ever to throw a perfect game. That is a pretty impressive start to a career. After age 30 for Hernandez, though, it would be the opposite. In the 4 years he played after he turned 30, his numbers were pretty bad. Over these 4 seasons, he put up an ERA of 4.89, an ERA plus of just 84, over 467 innings, and a BWAR of exactly 0, meaning that all of his value in his career came before he turned 30. After, he was just not the same and threw his last pitch at the age of 33 in 2019. He went from a 7-year stretch where in 6 of them he finished top 8 in Cy Young voting to being literally one of the worst starters in the league in the matter of just 2 years. Take a look at this graph here that shows the evolution of Hernandez's velocity over his career. Well, since 2007, as that's all the data that's available. When he was younger, he was averaging around 96 miles per hour while touching the upper 90s, which is very hard for a starter in 2008. Over time, though, that velocity would slowly fall, as you would expect, until 2016, when we saw a huge fall to just over 91 miles per hour. This is not a coincidence, as that's the year he turned 30, and his production fell off the table. Just 2 years later, in 2018, his average fastball was under 90 miles per hour. For a guy like King Felix, that is really bad. And if we add Hernandez's ERA plus to this graph, you can see the trends are very similar. As he lost his velocity, his run prevention also suffered heavily. The velocity and stuff is what made Felix so special, and once he lost it, he was never getting it back. This is a rather early age for a pitcher to lose their velocity though, right? Well, let's go back to the graph that shows the amount of innings a starter averages per game. You see, King Felix is a modern day arm. Great stuff, high velo, but he played during a time where the innings were still decently high for starting pitchers. He pitched 8 straight seasons of over 200 innings, and 5 of those seasons were over 230 innings. He pitched 190 innings at the age of 20 after being named the number 2 prospect in the entire league by Baseball America. You would just never see that today. There is a very good possibility that his arm was just worn out by the time he turned 30. Today, when we see big prospect pitchers come up like this, teams often baby them into it. We saw Paul Skeens last year, Garrett Crochet, Yuri Perez. Any of these young, very talented pitchers go nowhere near 200 innings their first season. This strategy possibly gives these pitchers better chances of sustaining their elite stuff for longer. He could have benefited from pitching in this part of the graph rather than when the usage of starters was all the way up here. If Felix pitched today, he probably could have kept his stuff into his 30s, but his overall innings wouldn't have seen a huge increase. Modern day starting pitchers just aren't going to rack up the counting stats that people often look at for the Hall of Fame, but that's why we should change what we look at for the Hall of Fame. One of the first questions many voters ask themselves when looking at a pitcher is, does he have 200 wins? Because if not, there is very little chance of that pitcher getting in. The only two pitchers to get through the writers' vote with under 200 wins are Sandy Koufax and Dazzy Vance. King Felix has just 169 wins in his career, a long way from the 200 number. This is a problem for multiple reasons. One, wins aren't completely reflective of the pitcher. Hernandez pitched his entire career for the post-2005 Mariners. Yeah, they aren't winning a lot of games. In fact, the teams that he played on often sucked. And number two, as we already talked about, starts are getting shorter. Thus, starting pitchers in general are going to be getting less wins. For me, Hernandez gets a pass, as should all modern starting pitchers with the wins. The next stat that often gets looked at is WAR, and Hernandez does not fare well at all with that. He has less than 50 B-WAR. The last time the writers voted in a pitcher with less than 50 B-WAR was in 1974 when they voted in Dizzy Dean, who pitched in the 1940s. The only active pitchers with over 50 WAR are Verlander, Kershaw, Scherzer, and Sale, who just passed it this year. The only pitchers since 2005 to do so are those four, and add in Zach Greinke and Cole Hamels. Are these the only starting pitchers of this generation that have a chance to get in? I don't think that should be the case. Let's add all pitchers with at least 40 WAR who debuted in 2005 or later. Now we have some pitchers like John Lester, David Price, and of course, King Felix. Then you also have some active guys like Garrett Cole and Jacob deGrom. Cole and deGrom have been two of the best pitchers that I've seen with my own eyes. But Cole and deGrom are nowhere near on pace to shatter any WAR records. Cole is 33 years old and deGrom is 36. Both of them have struggled with injuries, deGrom more so, and their best years are behind them. Their counting numbers just aren't going to look like a slam dunk Hall of Famer. deGrom could very well not even crack 50 WAR. Cole has more of a chance to get those counting numbers up, but there's no guarantee with what we see from modern starters. If you adjust these WAR values and use the era-adjusted value that I talked about earlier, they do start to look like Hall of Famers. deGrom already has 58.4 and Cole has 59.4. Obviously, those numbers can increase as they continue to pitch, and these numbers begin to look like Hall of Fame pitchers in their 30s. Let's apply this same stat to the retired pitchers. Cole Hamels for sure is a Hall of Famer with 75.3 era-adjusted WAR. Lester looks a lot better, and King Felix starts to look like he should get some heavy consideration. I think as we move forward with this new kind of starting pitcher, the peak needs to hold more value. The peaks of these pitchers are still relatively the same length as before, just their careers are shortened by modern usage strategies and the uptick in injuries. Once their peak is over, their career is essentially over. The modern day pitchers just don't get enough time to rack up the counting stats that pitchers did before. On the flip side, pitchers who are already in the Hall of Fame can lose value when you account for the era that they played in. Compare the era-adjusted modern pitchers to pitchers that are already in the Hall. To me, it looks like some of these guys are worthy of induction, and one of those guys is King Felix. Overall, King Felix represents a fascinating case in how we evaluate modern-day pitchers for the Hall of Fame. While his traditional counting stats like wins and WAR fall short of historical benchmarks, this shortfall is more of a reflection of how the game has evolved rather than his talent or impact. From his incredible peak as one of the best pitchers of his generation to the challenges he faced as his career ended, Hernandez's story is a perfect example of showing the need to reconsider how we compare players across eras. If we allow for a more nuanced understanding of value and excellence, Felix Hernandez has a compelling case for the Hall. The Hall of Fame should celebrate players who define their era, and for much of his career, King Felix was just that. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.